The 9 biblical signs. God is redefining who you are. There comes a moment when the old version of you no longer fits the life you are living. You still recognize your face, your voice, your history, but something deeper has shifted. The way you react is different. What once defined you no longer carries the same weight. Habits, labels, and expectations that once felt natural now feel foreign. And you may find yourself asking quietly, who am I becoming? This is not confusion. It is transition. Scripture shows that God often begins his greatest work not by changing circumstances, but by redefining identity. Before he redirects paths, he reshapes the heart. Before he reveals purpose, he removes false definitions. God does not build new futures on old identities. He refines who you are so that what comes next does not crush you. This process can feel unsettling because identity feels personal. When God starts touching who you are, not just what you do, it can feel like loss before it feels like clarity. You may sense distance from your old self without yet understanding the new one. You may feel exposed, stripped of roles or labels that once gave you certainty. But Scripture reveals that this is often how God prepares his people to live truthfully, freely, and purposefully. Redefinition does not mean erasing your story. It means redeeming it. God does not deny where you came from. He removes what no longer belongs so that what is true can emerge. He strips away identities shaped by fear, performance, approval, or pain, and replaces them with something anchored in him. If you have felt this internal shift, do not rush to label it as instability. God often unsettles what is false so that what is real can stand. When identity is being redefined, it may feel like you are losing parts of yourself, but in truth, you are being brought closer to who God always intended you to be. As we walk through these biblical signs together, do not listen with resistance. Listen with openness. God does not redefine identity to confuse you, but to free you. And when he begins redefining who you are, it is because the old version can no longer carry what he is preparing to entrust to you. When God is redefining who you are, one of the first signs is that old labels no longer feel true. Names that once described you, whether spoken by others or repeated in your own mind, begin to lose their power. You may have lived for years identified by failure, success, trauma, talent, or expectation. But now, those definitions feel incomplete. They no longer explain who you are becoming. This can feel disorienting because labels create familiarity. Even painful ones provide a sense of certainty. When God removes them, you may feel exposed. You may wonder how to explain yourself without the categories you once used. But Scripture shows that God always begins identity transformation by removing names that never came from him. You may notice that words spoken over you in the past no longer resonate. Compliments that once fueled you feel shallow. Criticism that once wounded you loses its sting. This is not emotional numbness. It is detachment. God is loosening your dependence on external definitions so your identity can be rooted in him. In the Bible, God often changed identity by changing names or redefining meaning. He did not do this to confuse his people, but to clarify who they truly were in his sight. When God redefines identity, he separates who you are from what you have done, what you have endured, and how others have perceived you. This stage often brings internal tension. Part of you may want to cling to familiar labels because they provide a script. Letting them go means stepping into uncertainty. But alignment requires courage. God removes labels so you are no longer living in response to the past, but in agreement with his truth. You may realize that you no longer introduce yourself the same way, not just in words, but in posture. You stop leading with accomplishments or defenses. You stop explaining yourself unnecessarily. There is less urgency to prove who you are. This quiet confidence is not pride. It is identity settling into truth. As old labels fall away, space opens. That space can feel empty at first, but it is intentional. God does not rush to fill it. He allows silence so that identity can be shaped carefully rather than copied quickly. He wants what replaces those labels to be formed by relationship, not performance. If you feel disconnected from names or definitions that once felt central to you, do not panic. This is not loss of self. It is refinement. God is separating you from identities that limited you so that what He speaks over you can take root without competition. When old labels no longer feel true, God is redefining who you are. He is teaching your heart to recognize His voice as the final authority over your identity. And identity rooted in Him is not fragile. It is steady, unshakable, and free. When God is redefining who you are, familiar patterns begin to break. Habits, reactions, and routines that once felt automatic no longer fit the way they used to. You may catch yourself responding differently to situations that once triggered the same behavior every time. What was predictable becomes uncomfortable. What was routine begins to feel misaligned. This shift can be confusing because patterns provide stability. Even unhealthy patterns offer a sense of control. When they start to break, you may feel ungrounded, but Scripture shows that God often disrupts patterns before He establishes identity. He interrupts cycles that no longer reflect who you are becoming. You may notice that behaviors you once tolerated now bother you. Choices that felt normal now create inner tension. This is not guilt, it is awareness. God is sharpening discernment so that old patterns cannot continue unnoticed. When identity changes, behavior must follow, but it often resists at first. Breaking patterns requires honesty. You begin to see where you were functioning on autopilot. You recognize habits that were driven by fear, validation, or avoidance. God does not expose these patterns to shame you. He reveals them so they can be released. Identity cannot be redefined while old cycles remain unchallenged. This stage can feel frustrating because effort alone does not fix it. You may try to return to familiar behaviors only to find they no longer satisfy. God allows this frustration to show that the old way cannot sustain the new identity. He is not asking you to try harder. He is inviting you to let go. Scripture shows that transformation often begins with disruption. God unsettles what is comfortable so that what is true can take root. When familiar patterns break, it is often because they were formed for a version of you that no longer exists. You may feel caught between who you were and who you are becoming. Old patterns no longer work, but new rhythms are still forming. This in-between space is uncomfortable, but it is intentional. God is teaching you to live consciously rather than automatically. As patterns break, dependence shifts. You rely less on habit and more on discernment. You pause before reacting. You choose instead of repeating. This intentionality is a sign of maturity. God is shaping identity that responds with wisdom rather than instinct. If familiar patterns are breaking in your life, do not rush to rebuild them. Let them fall away. God is not removing stability. He is replacing false stability with something grounded in truth. Identity redefinition requires space, and broken patterns create that space. When old patterns no longer function, God is redefining who you are. He is freeing you from cycles that belong to an earlier version of yourself, making room for a life that reflects who you are becoming in Him. When God is redefining who you are, you begin to feel disconnected from who you used to be. This separation is not rejection of your past, nor is it denial of your story. It is a quiet distancing. You look back at former versions of yourself and realize they no longer feel like home. The emotions, motivations, and priorities that once drove you feel unfamiliar now. This can be unsettling because the past is known territory. Even when it carried pain, it provided identity. When God creates distance from that version of you, it can feel like standing between two worlds. You are no longer who you were, but you are still discovering who you are becoming. Scripture shows that this space is not confusion, it is formation. You may notice that memories no longer define you the way they once did. Past failures do not carry the same weight. Past successes no longer fuel your confidence. You are not erasing the past. You are no longer living from it. God is teaching your heart to draw identity from Him rather than from experience. This disconnection often brings mixed emotions: gratitude for growth, grief for what is gone, and uncertainty about what lies ahead. God allows all of this because identity transformation requires honesty. You cannot step into what God is forming if you remain anchored to what He is redefining. Scripture reveals that God often leads people through seasons where they feel out of place with their former selves. This is not instability, it is alignment. When God is reshaping identity, He creates a holy dissatisfaction with who you were so that you are willing to embrace who He is forming. You may find that conversations from the past no longer resonate. Old goals feel empty, old reactions feel exaggerated. This does not mean you have become distant or cold. It means your inner world has changed. God is adjusting your perspective so that identity is no longer reactive, but rooted. This stage can feel lonely because the past is familiar and the future is undefined. But Scripture shows that God does not abandon people in this space. He walks with them through it. He allows identity to loosen from what is known so that it can attach fully to Him. Do not rush to recreate the old version of yourself just to feel comfortable again. That version carried what it needed for its season, but it cannot carry what God is preparing next. Trust the distance. It is protecting you from returning to something God has already moved you beyond. When you feel disconnected from who you used to be, God is redefining who you are. He is not erasing your story. He is repositioning it. And in that repositioning, identity begins to settle into something truer, deeper, and more aligned with who He created you to be. When God is redefining who you are, He begins confronting identity, not just behavior. In earlier seasons, correction may have focused on what you did wrong or what needed to change externally. But now, God goes deeper. He touches motives, intentions, and the posture of your heart. You realize that behavior was only a symptom. Identity was the root. This stage can feel uncomfortable because it removes hiding places. You can no longer fix things simply by adjusting actions or appearing obedient on the surface. God is not interested in temporary improvement. He is shaping who you are when no one is watching. He wants truth in the inward parts, not performance. You may notice that God convicts you about things others cannot see. Attitudes, thought patterns, hidden pride, subtle fear, the need for control. This is not condemnation, it is refinement. God corrects identity because identity determines direction. If the heart is misaligned, behavior will eventually follow. Scripture shows that God consistently addresses identity before assignment. He speaks to who people are becoming before He speaks to what they will do. This is why this season feels more internal than visible. God is not delaying progress. He is securing foundation. This kind of confrontation can feel intense because it requires honesty. You begin to recognize patterns that were never questioned before. You see how certain behaviors were rooted in insecurity, approval, or self-protection. God reveals these things not to shame you, but to free you. Identity cannot be redefined while false foundations remain untouched. You may feel exposed during this process. Things you once justified now feel out of place. Excuses lose their power. God is teaching your heart to live aligned even when it costs comfort. This is not punishment, it is preparation. As identity is confronted, integrity deepens. You become less interested in appearing right and more committed to being true. This shift changes how you pray, how you decide, and how you relate to others. God is forming consistency between who you are inside and how you live outside. This stage also brings clarity. When identity is refined, confusion decreases. You know what you stand for. You recognize what does not belong. God is simplifying your inner world so that obedience becomes clearer and more natural. If you sense God addressing deeper issues than surface behavior, do not resist it. This is a strong sign that He is redefining who you are. He is not fixing habits. He is shaping character, and character rooted in truth can carry responsibility without compromise. When God confronts identity rather than behavior, He is doing lasting work. He is forming a version of you that does not need constant correction because it is aligned from the inside out. When God is redefining who you are, your environment begins to change in subtle but undeniable ways. Places, conversations, routines, and atmospheres that once felt comfortable no longer nourish your soul. What once energized you now leaves you drained. What once felt like home now feels misaligned. This shift is not accidental. It is deeply connected to identity. In earlier seasons, God often allows people to remain in environments that support growth at that stage. Those environments may have served a purpose, even if they were imperfect. But when identity begins to change, the same environments can no longer sustain the new formation taking place within you. God does not change you in isolation. He also adjusts what surrounds you. This transition can feel confusing because nothing external may appear wrong. The people may still be kind. The routines may still function. The places may still be familiar, yet something inside you knows that staying connected to those environments requires effort that feels unnatural. This discomfort is not arrogance or dissatisfaction, it is discernment awakening. Scripture shows that when God reshapes identity, He also reshapes context. Not always by dramatic removal, but often by internal disengagement. You begin to feel less connected to conversations that revolve around things you have outgrown. You feel restless in atmospheres that once felt safe. God is not isolating you. He is protecting the work He is doing in you. This stage often reveals how environment shapes identity more than we realize. Certain spaces reinforced old patterns, old thinking, old reactions. As those patterns break, the environment no longer feels neutral. It becomes either supportive or draining. God allows you to feel this contrast so you can choose alignment intentionally. You may notice that silence now feels healthier than noise. Depth feels more satisfying than surface-level interaction. Truth matters more than familiarity. This does not mean you reject people. It means your soul is becoming selective about what it absorbs. God is teaching you to guard what He is forming. This shift can also bring grief. Letting go of environments means letting go of memories, routines, and versions of yourself that once existed there. God allows that grief because it honors transition. Identity change always involves loss, but that loss creates space for something truer to grow. You may be tempted to force yourself to remain connected just to avoid discomfort, but staying where your soul is no longer fed can slowly weaken what God is strengthening. This is why God allows the discomfort to persist. It is guidance, not rejection. As environments shift, clarity increases. You become more aware of what aligns and what does not. You recognize where peace increases and where it drains. God is teaching you to discern alignment, not just by logic, but by spiritual awareness. If you find that certain environments no longer feed your soul, do not label yourself as ungrateful or distant. This is often a sign that God is redefining who you are. He is aligning your surroundings with your becoming. Identity cannot mature in environments that constantly pull it backward. God reshapes context so identity can stabilize. And when your environment begins to change, it is often because the person you are becoming can no longer live where the old version survived. When God is redefining who you are, your relationships begin to shift naturally, often without drama or explanation. This change can be one of the most difficult aspects of identity transformation because relationships are deeply tied to belonging. People who once felt close may begin to feel distant. Conversations that once flowed easily may now feel forced or shallow. This does not happen because love disappears, but because alignment is changing. In earlier seasons, relationships may have been built around shared habits, shared struggles, or shared stages of life. Those connections were real and meaningful for that time. But when identity begins to change, the foundation of some relationships no longer supports who you are becoming. God does not sever connections harshly. He allows them to loosen gradually so the heart can adjust without bitterness. You may notice that certain relationships require you to shrink, perform, or explain yourself in ways that now feel exhausting. You may feel pressure to remain the same so others feel comfortable. This tension is not coincidence. God is revealing which relationships are rooted in familiarity and which are rooted in truth. Scripture shows that when God redefines identity, relationships reorganize. This is not punishment, it is protection. God knows that identity under construction is sensitive. Constant misunderstanding, comparison, or subtle resistance can slow the work He is doing. So He allows some relationships to quiet down, not out of rejection, but out of wisdom. This season can feel lonely. You may grieve connections that once mattered deeply. You may wonder if you are becoming distant or difficult. But Scripture reminds us that not every separation is a failure. Some are transitions. God allows distance so identity can stabilize without interference. At the same time, other relationships may begin to deepen. Conversations become more honest. Silence becomes more comfortable. There is less need to impress and more freedom to be real. These connections feel lighter, not because they demand less, but because they align more closely with who you are becoming. God also uses this stage to refine how you love others. You learn to remain kind without overextending. You learn to honor people without living for their approval. Identity redefinition teaches you to hold relationships with open hands rather than clenched expectations. You may be tempted to force closeness where alignment no longer exists, just to avoid change. But forced connection often leads to internal conflict. God allows relationships to shift so your inner world can settle into truth. Identity cannot be fully redefined while constantly negotiating who you are allowed to be. This process requires grace. Grace for others who may not understand your change. Grace for yourself as you learn to navigate new boundaries. God is not asking you to cut people off. He is teaching you to relate from integrity rather than obligation. If you notice that relationships are shifting without hostility, but with distance, pay attention. This is often a sign of identity being redefined. God is not removing people to leave you alone. He is creating space for relationships that support truth, growth, and authenticity. When identity changes, relationships reorganize. And though the transition may feel quiet and painful at times, it ultimately brings peace. God is teaching you that belonging rooted in truth is far safer than belonging rooted in familiarity. When God is redefining who you are, you begin to feel a deeper pull toward purpose rather than approval. The need to be seen, affirmed, or constantly validated starts to lose its grip on your decisions. What once influenced your choices heavily, opinions, applause, recognition, or fear of disappointment, no longer carries the same authority over your heart. This shift is subtle, but it is profound. In earlier seasons, approval may have felt necessary for survival. You learned to adjust yourself to fit expectations, to avoid conflict, or to maintain acceptance. That behavior was not weakness, it was often protection. But when God begins redefining identity, He gently loosens the hold of approval so that obedience can grow without fear. You may notice that you are less concerned with how decisions appear and more concerned with whether they are true. Choices begin to be filtered through conviction instead of reaction. You still care about people, but their opinions no longer override God's direction in your life. This is not rebellion, it is maturity. Scripture shows that purpose always requires freedom from approval. No one can walk fully in God's calling while being ruled by the expectations of others. God knows this, which is why redefining identity includes redefining what you listen to. When purpose begins to rise, the noise of approval must quiet. This transition can feel uncomfortable because approval once provided clarity. When people agreed with you, you felt secure. When they praised you, you felt confident. As that reliance fades, you may feel exposed. You may question whether you are doing the right thing when affirmation is absent. But this is where faith deepens. God is teaching you to trust Him without external confirmation. You may notice that you are more willing to disappoint others if it means remaining faithful. This does not mean you become careless or insensitive. It means obedience now matters more than acceptance. God is aligning your heart so that integrity guides you, not fear of rejection. This shift also brings peace. The constant pressure to explain yourself fades. You stop rehearsing how your decisions will be received. You act with quiet confidence, not because you are certain of outcomes, but because you are aligned with purpose. That alignment brings rest. As approval loses power, authenticity increases. You no longer feel the need to present a polished version of yourself. You are more honest about limitations, questions, and growth. God is forming identity that does not depend on performance. Purpose-driven identity does not need constant validation. You may still appreciate encouragement, but you no longer depend on it. You listen without being ruled by it. This balance is essential. God is not isolating you, He is freeing you. Identity rooted in purpose can serve faithfully without being controlled by opinion. If you feel less motivated by applause and more guided by conviction, do not resist it. This is a strong sign that God is redefining who you are. He is teaching you to live from calling rather than reaction. And when purpose becomes stronger than approval, identity settles into something steady, honest, and resilient. When God is redefining who you are, you begin to feel an inner call to live more authentically. This call is not loud or dramatic. It does not demand attention. It whispers steadily, inviting you to stop pretending, stop performing, and stop living divided. You become increasingly uncomfortable with masks you once wore effortlessly. What once felt necessary to survive now feels dishonest to maintain. In earlier seasons, adapting yourself may have felt wise. You learned when to speak, when to stay quiet, how to fit expectations, and how to protect parts of yourself. That adaptation served a purpose at the time. But when God begins redefining identity, authenticity becomes non-negotiable. You can no longer live fragmented, presenting one version of yourself publicly while carrying another privately. This shift often begins internally. You notice tension when your actions do not match your convictions. You feel unrest when your words do not reflect your heart. God is not accusing you. He is inviting you into wholeness. Identity cannot be redefined while the soul remains divided. Scripture shows that God values truth in the inward parts. He is not interested in curated faith or outward appearance. He desires alignment between who you are becoming and how you live. This is why authenticity becomes urgent during identity transformation. God is forming integrity, not image. You may notice that you are less willing to tolerate self-betrayal. Saying yes when you mean no begins to weigh on you. Staying silent when truth is required becomes uncomfortable. Living for appearance rather than conviction drains you. This is not rigidity, it is clarity. God is teaching your heart to live honestly before Him. Authenticity also brings vulnerability. You may fear that showing your true self will lead to misunderstanding or rejection. God allows this fear to surface because authentic identity requires trust. You learn to place your security in God rather than in how others perceive you. This stage can feel risky. Letting go of performance means releasing control over how you are received. But Scripture shows that freedom always follows truth. When identity is no longer built on image, peace increases. You stop managing impressions and start living intentionally. As authenticity grows, relationships change. Some people respond with respect and deeper connection. Others may feel uncomfortable with your honesty. God allows this sorting because authentic identity cannot thrive where pretense is required. He is not asking you to expose everything to everyone. He is teaching you to live without contradiction. You may also notice greater compassion for others. When you stop performing, you stop demanding performance from those around you. Authenticity creates space for grace. God is shaping identity that reflects His heart, not just His standards. If you feel a growing need to live truthfully, even when it costs comfort, do not ignore it. This is a strong sign that God is redefining who you are. He's calling you out of survival mode and into integrity. He is teaching you that you do not need to impress to belong. When authenticity becomes a priority, identity stabilizes. You are no longer fragmented by fear or expectation. You are becoming whole. And a whole heart is where God's work settles deeply and lasts. When God is redefining who you are, peace begins to increase even when clarity is incomplete. This is one of the deepest and most reliable signs of identity transformation. Nothing around you may be fully resolved. Questions may still exist. The future may still feel undefined. Yet inside, something has settled. The urgency is gone. The inner noise has quieted. You are no longer driven by anxiety to figure everything out. Earlier in your journey, peace may have depended on certainty. When plans were clear, you felt calm. When answers arrived quickly, you felt secure. But now, peace remains even when outcomes are unknown. This is not indifference. It is trust. God is teaching your heart to rest in Him rather than in explanations. Scripture shows that this kind of peace does not come from control. It comes from alignment. When the heart is no longer fighting God's process, peace naturally follows. You are no longer trying to force timing, manage perception, or protect yourself from every possible outcome. You are learning to remain present with God in the middle of uncertainty. This peace often surprises people. They expect anxiety when answers are missing. They expect fear when direction is unclear. But instead, you feel grounded, steady. You may still think deeply, plan wisely, and pray sincerely, but panic no longer dictates your decisions. God is anchoring your identity in Him rather than in circumstances. You may notice that uncertainty no longer paralyzes you. You are able to wait without resentment. You can move forward without having every detail resolved. This does not mean you are careless. It means your heart is no longer dependent on certainty to function. God is redefining identity so that peace is internal, not conditional. This stage protects you from impulsive choices. When peace remains in uncertainty, you are less likely to rush into decisions just to relieve discomfort. You no longer confuse urgency with obedience. God is teaching you that alignment often requires patience, not immediate clarity. Peace in uncertainty also deepens faith. You stop asking God to explain Himself constantly and start trusting His presence. You learn that His nearness matters more than immediate answers. This kind of faith is not loud or dramatic. It is steady, quiet, and deeply rooted. You may notice that others question your calm. They may expect stress where there is none. They may not understand how you can be at peace without guarantees. That peace is not denial, it is discernment. God has aligned your heart enough that fear no longer has authority over you. This peace does not remove responsibility, it strengthens it. You are able to carry decisions, conversations, and waiting seasons without internal collapse. God strengthens identity so that peace can remain when life becomes complex. If peace is growing in your life while clarity is still unfolding, pay attention. This is not coincidence, it is confirmation. God is redefining who you are by teaching your heart that safety is found in Him, not in outcomes. When peace remains without full clarity, identity has reached a deeper foundation. God has brought your heart into alignment with His presence, and from that place, whatever comes next can be faced with confidence, humility, and trust. God does not redefine identity casually. What He has been doing in you is intentional, careful, and deeply personal. Every shift you noticed, every discomfort you felt, every moment when the old version of you no longer fit was not a mistake or a loss of direction. It was evidence of transformation. God has been reshaping who you are so that your life can reflect truth rather than habit, purpose rather than performance, and peace rather than fear. If you look back now, you may realize that this process did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, quietly, often invisibly. God removed labels that limited you, broke patterns that no longer served you, distanced you from identities rooted in the past, confronted the heart rather than surface behavior, adjusted environments and relationships, weakened the grip of approval, called you into authenticity, and anchored you in peace even without full clarity. None of that was accidental. It was formation. Redefining identity always comes before revealing direction. God does not send people forward until they are rooted. He does not entrust purpose to hearts that are still divided. He strengthens identity so that when responsibility comes, it does not crush you. What He is building in you now is not just for a moment, but for endurance. You may not yet see where this is leading, and that is okay. Identity does not need a map to remain faithful. It needs alignment, and alignment is exactly what God has been working on. When who you are becomes steady, where you are going becomes less threatening. You stop rushing, you stop comparing, you stop forcing clarity. You learn to walk with God rather than ahead of Him. As you close this message, do not rush back into noise or distraction. Take a moment to recognize what God has already done in you. The discomfort you felt was not weakness, it was growth. The distance from your old self was not loss, it was progress. The peace you carry now is not complacency, it is grounding. If this message spoke to your heart and helped you recognize God's work in your identity, take a simple step of response. Leaving a like on this video helps this message reach others who may be experiencing the same quiet transformation. And if you feel led, write a short phrase in the comments, something honest and simple like, "God is redefining me," or "I trust who God is forming." Speaking that truth matters more than you think. If you want to continue walking through messages that bring clarity, depth, and spiritual grounding, consider subscribing to this channel, not as a routine, but as a space where reflection and alignment can remain part of your journey. God is not finished with you. Identity is not a destination, it is a foundation. And the foundation God is building in you now will support everything He unfolds next. Remain open, remain faithful, remain grounded. God knows exactly who He is forming you to be.